AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have a very interesting guest. He is an established author, but this is his first foray into espionage and counter-espionage. His name is Jesse Fink. He's an established author with about 6 books. He was born in London, studied at various schools in Sydney, attended the University of Technology, got his degree in journalism, and began writing initially about sports. But now he has a recent book out. It's called The Eagle in the Mirror. It's a story about Dick Ellis. Jesse, welcome to AFIO Now.
Great to be here, mate.
Jesse, off camera, we were just talking about how you got started on this journey, and I think it would be interesting to share with our audience a little bit how you got interested in Dick Ellis and did the research on the book.
Well, I had at the end of 2019, I had finished a book called Pure Narco, which was about cocaine trafficking, and I had worked with a cocaine trafficker from Miami, and it had been a sort of very difficult book to write. I'd spent about 3 years working on it, and was very excited about finishing, and the release date was 2020. And of course, as you know, the pandemic hit, and that completely sort of destroyed the sort of commercial prospects for that book. And we were in lockdown in Sydney, and I actually at that point was wondering whether I was going to be able to write another book at all. And my father and I, we would get together sort of every day, if we could, to have a cup of coffee in a cafe. That was sort of our social outlet with each other. And then because of lockdown, we literally couldn't go to a cafe and sit down. They actually outlawed sitting down at tables. So the only thing that was open in Sydney at that point was supermarkets, petrol stations and thrift shops or charity stores. And my father was hanging out at a charity store, sort of buying up secondhand books that he could take home and read to alleviate the boredom of lockdown. And he came across a copy of A Man Called Intrepid about William Stevenson. And the foreword to that book had been written by Dick Ellis. And so Fred got on the phone to me and said, "Have you heard of Dick Ellis?" And I hadn't heard of Dick Ellis at all. And he sort of sketched out for me sort of the arc of Ellis's life, and I thought that's a pretty remarkable story. And the ironic thing was that where my father lived in Sydney was actually where Dick Ellis had grown up as a child. And so I knew nothing about Ellis, and I ended up literally getting in my car and trying to find his childhood home, and it's just sort of started this journey for me into this incredible Australian who had essentially got to the top of the intelligence services of the United Kingdom and the United States. And it was a very bizarre and remarkable story.
That's a great beginning. Jesse, tell our audience a little bit about Ellis's early life and how that affected later career choices.
Well, he had, like I said, he'd grown up in Annandale in Sydney, and his mother died when he was about 3. And so his father was left to raise him and his brother, and wasn't really able to take care of him properly. So the Ellis boys were shunted off to various sort of foster homes around Australia in their formative years. And so they didn't really get much of an education until such time as Dick Ellis fell under the wing of a kindly schoolmaster in Victoria, Australia, and, you know, was introduced to the classics and sort of started learning to play music and really got the education that he wasn't sort of given when he was a young man. And he ended up playing in a chamber orchestra in Melbourne. He went to night classes at the University of Melbourne and managed to get a scholarship to Oxford University. And this was in 1914. So he sort of went off to England, and of course the First World War broke out. So his plans to study at Oxford were kiboshed, and he ended up joining the British Army and went to the Western Front, was injured multiple times. And while he was convalescing, he started learning Russian and developed this sort of great facility for languages. And in the end, he actually ended up speaking about 10 languages. Now, that was obviously very useful to the intelligence corps of the British Army. And so Ellis rose up the ranks fairly quickly in the intelligence corps, and sort of by the early 20s, he was actually studying at Oxford. He was studying Russian, and he was recruited there into MI6.
What were his early years in British SIS like? What kind of assignments did he have?
Well, because of his facility for the Russian language and his interest in Russian politics and communism, his target was the Soviet Union. So he was sent out to Constantinople, what is today Istanbul, and was asked basically to work on the Russian target in Turkey. And then he ended up being transferred around various stations in Western Europe. So Berlin, Vienna, Geneva, Paris, and then he actually spent quite a bit of time in London also in the 30s. But from what I've gathered, sort of researching his life, was really tasked with, I guess, infiltrating the white Russian community, the Ukrainian community in Western Europe in the 20s and 30s. And his assignment, I guess, was pretty much sort of gathering information from white Russian exiles who were living in Western Europe at that time. And so that involved paying off or obtaining information from various sort of double and triple agents. And this is where I believe sort of Ellis eventually got into a bit of trouble.
What was his early involvement like in World War II?
So he ended up deputising for William Stevenson at British Security Coordination, which was really an MI6 station in New York, which was essentially created to get the United States into the Second World War, certainly from the British perspective. So he had a cover job as a consul in New York, but he was very actively involved with liaising with the FBI, with setting up a coordinator of information, what became the OSS. So he wrote a blueprint for Donovan and the creation of this new American Secret Intelligence Service. And he was at a very high level sort of with the British in their liaison with the American government sort of during the Second World War. He was sort of very actively involved in the lead up to Pearl Harbor, and he was awarded the Legion of Merit by Truman after the war. So he was a highly regarded personage in British intelligence circles and American intelligence circles all through that sort of Second World War and post-war period. And then after the Second World War was sent out to the Far East, he sort of headed up operations for MI6 in Singapore, Hong Kong. He was very interested in monitoring kind of communist activity in Southeast Asia. He worked for the Australian government in setting up their own Secret Intelligence Service, and really went through to the late 60s, early 70s as a sort of as an agent in the field. So he had incredible longevity. We were talking about someone who joined the service in the early 20s and went through to the 1970s. It was quite a career.
Describe for our audience the controversy involving Dick Ellis and his involvement with the Nazis and his possible involvement with the Soviets.
Well, this sort of all came about because after Dick Ellis died in 1975, not long afterward, a book was written by a guy called Chapman Pincher, who wrote a book there called Their Traitor's Treachery. in which he kind of named Ellis as this suspected Nazi Soviet mole, essentially. And this book had done very well for Chapman Pincher, and the source for most of Pincher's allegations against Ellis was actually a guy called Peter Wright. Now, I don't know if your viewers are familiar with Peter Wright, but Peter Wright was a MI5 operative who wrote a book called Spycatcher in 1987, which sort of became this massive hit around the world and made Wright a lot of money, where Wright again sort of brought up this case against Ellis, where he said that Ellis had sort of been under the nose of the British and the American intelligence services all this time until his death, that he had been as much of a villain as Kim Philby, that he had been working for the Nazis prior to the Second World War, and that after and during the Second World War he'd been working for the Soviets. The problem was for Ellis was that at some point he had accepted some money from one of his sources in Berlin, and apparently he had explained that he had used this money for his then wife's medical condition, or that she needed some sort of medical treatment, and that was why this money was taken. But out of this sort of serious allegation, it basically took on a life of its own, and sort of all these incredible and outlandish allegations were made against Ellis by Pincher and by Wright in the 1980s. His name was completely trashed. So the source for most of these sort of serious charges against Ellis were supposedly contained in these interrogation reports of Nazis that had been sort of examined following the defection of Kim Philby in 1963. So, of course, what happened with Philby was a great shock to MI6 and the CIA and the FBI. Everyone was sort of scrambling to find out how this had happened, and also to find other potential Soviet moles. So they were going through all these old files, and they found an interrogation report of a senior Nazi who had claimed that one of their primary sources before the war was a Captain Ellis, no first name, just Captain Ellis. This report had apparently sort of passed the desk of Kim Philby in about 1946, and Kim Philby had sort of made a notation on this report where the interrogator of this Nazi had asked, who is this Ellis? And Philby had actually said that he didn't know who Ellis was and that no further action needed to be taken. But the problem was that Philby and Ellis actually sort of were working in the same building at the time. So people were looking at this document thinking, why is Philby answering in this way? Why is he covering for Ellis? What's going on here? So a case was made that Ellis had some answering to do, and they sort of hauled him into an interrogation in 1965 in London. And it was put to him that he had betrayed the kingdom, that he had sort of taken money from the Nazis, and supposedly a confession was made, but this confession has never actually turned up anywhere. No one knows what is in this confession other than Peter Wright, who is now deceased, and there is little real evidence against Ellis apart from this supposed confession. So I make a case in the book that Ellis was actually sort of operating under the orders of the head of MI6 at that time, and that anything that he was involved in that probably involved him accepting some money from a source was probably part of a sort of a bigger strategy and was done with the orders of his superiors. So I think ultimately Ellis fell on his sword. He was trying to protect the people higher up in the organisation. And the evidence to support that is that even after these serious allegations against Ellis were made, he enjoyed the support of the head of MI6 up until his death.
Well, it's a fascinating story. Australian who became a British senior intelligence officer, had tremendous impact on British intelligence, American intelligence, Australian intelligence, but whose name was tarnished toward the end of his career.
Mm.
The name of the book is The Eagle in the Mirror, and I want to thank Jesse Fink for a very interesting interview.
Thanks, mate. I'm sorry about the technical problems earlier.
No worries.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.org.